Welcome to Night Shift Pulse. Comment your city and the time below. The night connects us all. If you enjoy what you hear, please subscribe. Let's step into the dark. Story 1. The intake counselor who couldn't close a file. I was 3 months into my shift rotation when the system flagged a file I couldn't remember opening. It was 2:47 in the morning and I'd just finished processing a voluntary admission. Standard protocol, low acuity, bed assigned within 20 minutes. I returned to my workstation to finalize the paperwork when I noticed the tab still blinking in the upper corner of my screen. Patient file 7732. Status, pending completion. I clicked it open expecting a browser glitch or a form I'd forgotten to submit. Instead, I found my own handwriting filling fields I had no memory of typing. The Laurel Ridge Behavioral Health Center processed an average of 11 admissions per night shift. My role as intake counselor required clinical efficiency. Assess immediate risk, document presenting symptoms, coordinate bed placement, and close the file within 45 minutes. I'd been trained to recognize patterns, the cadence of mania, the flat affect of dissociation, the calculated calm of someone planning harm. What I had not been trained for was documentation that wrote itself. The patient's name was listed as Trevor Hallis. Age 31, voluntary admission, chief complaint, persistent sense of incompletion. I read through the intake notes slowly, trying to locate the moment I had conducted this interview. The language was mine, phrasing I used habitually, abbreviations specific to my documentation style, but I had no recollection of speaking to anyone named Trevor Hallis. I checked the bed assignment log. He was listed in room 214 observation unit. I called the charge nurse on that floor and asked if she could confirm his arrival. She put me on hold and I heard the muted shuffle of clipboards and keys. When she returned, her tone was unchanged. Yes, she said. Trevor Hallis. Arrived at 2:18. Cooperative oriented ×3. Resting quietly. I thanked her and hung up. The intake form was still open on my screen. I scrolled to the bottom, intending to mark it complete and move on with my shift. But as I positioned my cursor over the Finalize button, a new line of text appeared beneath my last entry. Patient reports difficulty distinguishing between tasks completed and tasks that feel completed. I stared at the sentence. I had not typed it. My hands had not moved. The text simply materialized, formatted identically to the rest of the document, time-stamped 2:51 in the morning. I refreshed the page. The line remained. I closed the browser and reopened it. The file reloaded with the new sentence intact. I told myself it was a software error. The electronic health record system had been updated recently, and there had been complaints about autofill glitches. I made a note to report it to IT in the morning. Then I manually entered my closing summary, clicked Finalize, and logged out. The next night, the file reappeared. It was listed again as pending despite my having closed it less than 24 hours earlier. When I opened it, I found additional text beneath my closing summary. The handwriting style was unmistakably mine. The new entry read, "Patient describes a recurring sensation of returning to conversations already held. Notes that others do not acknowledge repetition. Expresses concern that he may be caught in a clerical loop." I felt my pulse quicken. I scrolled up through the document, searching for any indication that I had reopened the file during a moment of distraction or fatigue. There was none. The timestamps were clear. The new text had been added at 3:02 in the morning, approximately 10 minutes ago according to the system clock. But I had been in the break room at that time, heating soup in the microwave and scrolling through my phone. I called the observation unit again. This time, a different nurse answered. I asked about Trevor Hallis. She confirmed he was still in room 214. Stable, no incidents. Sleeping. I asked if he had requested to speak with anyone. She said no. He'd been alone since admission. I returned to the intake form and attempted to finalize it a second time. The moment I clicked submit, another line appeared. Patient states he has tried to leave multiple times but continues to wake up in the same room, completing the same intake process. My hand hovered over the keyboard. I did not type a response, but I wanted to. I wanted to ask the document what it was doing, who was writing it, why it had chosen my file and my handwriting. Instead, I logged out, shut down my workstation, and walked to the observation unit. Room 214 was at the end of a narrow hallway lit by motion sensor overheads. I swiped my badge and pushed the door open slowly. The man inside was sitting upright on the edge of the bed, hands folded in his lap. He looked up when I entered, and his expression was calm, expectant. He did not seem surprised to see me. I introduced myself and asked how he was feeling. He smiled faintly. "You've already asked me that," he said. I told him I didn't recall our previous conversation. He nodded as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "That's the difficult part," he said. "You won't, but you'll keep writing it down." I asked him what he meant. He gestured toward the clipboard I was holding, a blank intake form I'd brought instinctively, though I had no intention of conducting another interview. "You're going to document this," he said. "And then you're going to try to close the file, but it won't close because we're not finished yet." I felt a chill move through my shoulders. I asked him what we were supposed to finish. He looked at me with an expression that was not unkind, but deeply tired. "I don't know," he said. "I was hoping you did." I left the room without another word. I returned to my workstation, opened the file, and stared at the blinking cursor beneath the most recent entry. I did not type anything. I simply waited. And at 3:29 in the morning, a new line appeared. Counselor acknowledges growing uncertainty regarding origin of documentation. Patient remains cooperative. File remains open. Over the following nights, I stopped trying to finalize the file. It updated itself regardless of my actions. Each entry was calm, procedural, and written in a voice I could not distinguish from my own. The text described conversations I did not remember having, observations I had not consciously made, and a patient who never left room 214 but somehow remained in a perpetual state of intake. I began to notice that other files were harder to close. I would complete an assessment, submit my notes, and return hours later to find them flagged as incomplete. My supervisor mentioned that my documentation had become unusually thorough, almost obsessive. She did not say it was a problem, only that it was noted. I visited Trevor Hallis one final time, 3 weeks after his admission. He was still sitting on the edge of the bed, hands folded, expression unchanged. I asked him if he remembered me. He said, "You ask me that every time." I wanted to argue, but I could not say with certainty that he was wrong. I no longer attempt to finalize his file. It updates itself during my shifts, adding observations I might have made, questions I might have asked. I have started to wonder if intake was ever meant to be completed, or if some assessments are designed to remain perpetually open, waiting for a conclusion that will never arrive. And lately I have begun to notice my own handwriting appearing in files I know I have never touched. Calm, procedural, familiar. As if someone somewhere is still conducting my intake, and I am still waiting for them to finish. Story 2. The orderly assigned to Observation Wing D. The wing was locked down by 9 in the evening, and I'd circle through every 45 minutes with my clipboard, flashlight, and key card. I'd worked Observation Wing D for nearly 2 years, and the routine had become automatic. Check vitals through the door window, verify the patient was in their assigned bed, mark the time, move on. Wing D was considered low risk. These were patients stable enough to sleep unmonitored but not yet cleared for discharge. My supervisor once told me it was the easiest assignment in the facility. She was right until I started counting wrong. It began with a discrepancy so minor I dismissed it entirely. I was completing my 11:30 rounds when I realized the head count didn't match the census sheet. According to my paperwork, Wing D housed 9 patients that night, but when I physically counted the occupied rooms, I came up with 10. I recounted, still 10. I checked the master log at the nurses' station. 9 patients, 9 names, 9 room assignments. I walked the hall a third time, slower now, shining my flashlight through each door window. Every bed was occupied. I marked my sheet, made a note about a potential logging error, and continued my shift. The following night, the same thing happened. 9 patients on paper, 10 bodies in beds. I mentioned it to the charge nurse during shift change, and she pulled up the electronic census. 9 active patients. No admissions after 6 in the evening. She asked if I'd miscounted. I said it was possible. She suggested I was fatigued. I agreed, though I wasn't. I started documenting my rounds with more precision. I wrote down not only the room numbers, but the physical descriptions of the patients I observed. Height, build, hair color, visible identifiers. Wing D had long-term patients whose faces I knew well. There was Gordon, the man in room 401 who always slept facing the wall. There was Diane in 407, who kept her hands folded over her chest like she was rehearsing for a funeral. There was Martin, 412, who paced until sedation, and then collapsed diagonally across his mattress. On my third night of careful documentation, I noticed something that made my hands go cold. I had counted 10 patients again, but when I reviewed my notes, I found that I had described the same person twice. Once in room 403, once in room 415. Same build, same posture, same dark hair pressed against the pillow in the exact same way. I went back and checked both windows. The patients looked similar but not identical. I convinced myself I had made an error in my notes. I crossed out the duplicate and continued my rounds. But the next week I saw my own handwriting in the log before I'd written it. I was filling out the 12:15 check when I noticed that my previous entry from 11:30 was already completed in blue ink. My pen, my handwriting. The time was marked. The patient names were listed. The signatures matched mine. But I had not yet conducted the 11:30 rounds. I checked my watch. It was only 11:22. I stood at the nurse's station for several minutes, staring at the page, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps I had filled it out early by mistake, anticipating the next round. But the details were too specific. Patients I had not yet checked were already marked as stable. Rooms I had not yet entered were already noted as secure. I flipped back through the previous pages. My handwriting appeared in entries I could not recall making, scattered across nights I thought I remembered clearly. I walked to the supervisor's office and asked to review the surveillance recordings from Wing D. She asked why. I told her I wanted to verify my rounds, that I suspected I might be experiencing gaps in my memory. She gave me access to the past week of footage, and I sat in the dim monitoring room with the video cued to my last shift. I watched myself enter the wing at 9:04. I watched myself unlock each door, shine the flashlight, mark the clipboard. The footage was mundane, repetitive. But at 11:36, I saw something that made me pause the video. I was standing in the hallway outside room 410, but I was also visible in the background, walking toward the nurse's station. 2 of me. Same uniform, same posture, same clipboard. I rewound the footage. The image remained. I forwarded slowly, frame by frame. The second figure moved with the same gait, checked the same doors, marked the same times. At one point, both versions of me stood less than 10 feet apart, facing opposite directions. Neither acknowledged the other. I reported the footage to my supervisor. She reviewed it in silence, then closed the window and suggested I take a few days off. She said the night shift could cause perceptual distortions, especially in individuals predisposed to dissociative episodes. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant I should rest. I asked if she'd seen what I'd seen. She said she'd seen enough to recommend a temporary leave. I refused. I returned to Wing D the following night, determined to understand what was happening. I conducted my rounds with obsessive attention. I photographed my clipboard after each entry. I left my phone recording audio in my pocket. I marked the time on my watch before and after every check. And at 12:03 in the morning, I found a door I had already checked standing open. Room 414. The patient inside, a man named Kyle, was sitting on the edge of his bed staring at the doorway. I asked him why his door was open. He said I had opened it. I told him I hadn't been to his room yet. He looked at me with an expression that wasn't confused, just resigned. He said, "You were here 10 minutes ago. You asked me the same thing." I checked my clipboard. There was no entry for room 414. I checked my phone's audio recording. At 11:53, there was a stretch of silence, then the sound of a door opening. My own voice asking why the door was open. And Kyle's voice responding exactly as he had just responded. I asked him if he'd seen me enter the wing earlier tonight. He nodded. I asked how many times. He thought for a moment, then said, "I stopped counting." I looked down the hallway. It was empty. I turned back to Kyle and asked him if he thought I was real. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question for the first time. Then he said, "Does it matter?" Over the following weeks, I began to suspect that my job was not to monitor the patients in Wing D, but to complete a loop I could not exit. My rounds appeared in the log before I conducted them. My image appeared in surveillance footage I had not yet recorded. Patients I did not recognize began to greet me by name, referencing conversations I could not remember. And one night, while reviewing the census list, I noticed a name I had not seen before. My own, listed in room 422. Admission date 3 years prior. Status, stable. Observed nightly. I walked to room 422. The door was locked. I used my key card. It didn't work. I peered through the window. The bed was occupied. The figure was lying on their side, facing away from the door. The build was familiar. The uniform was mine. I knocked on the glass. The figure did not move. I knocked again, harder. Nothing. I returned to the nurse's station and checked the surveillance feed for room 422. The camera showed an empty bed. I walked back to the door and looked inside. The figure was still there, motionless, breathing evenly. I stood in that hallway for a long time, trying to decide whether I should open the door or continue my rounds. In the end, I chose neither. I marked my clipboard, noted the time, and moved on to the next room. Because that's what orderlies do. We observe, we document, we move through the same halls night after night, counting everyone except ourselves. And if the head count is wrong, we adjust the numbers, not the routine. Some of us have been adjusting for years. Story 3. The psychiatrist's sessions that repeated verbatim. I had been conducting weekly sessions with patient 1149 for approximately 6 months when I first noticed the repetition. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unremarkable in nearly every clinical respect. The patient, identified in my notes only by number per institutional privacy protocols, sat across from me in the low-backed chair, hands resting on his knees, gaze fixed on a point just over my left shoulder. I asked my standard opening question. "How have you been feeling since our last session?" He answered, as he often did, with a measured, almost scripted response. "About the same. No significant changes." I typed his answer into my tablet and proceeded through my usual structure: mood assessment, behavioral observation, medication adherence. The session lasted 47 minutes. It followed the expected rhythm. I closed my notes, scheduled our next appointment, and moved on to my remaining caseload. I had no reason to think the session was unusual until the following week, when he said the exact same words. Not similar words, the exact words. Same pauses, same inflection, same moment of eye contact when he said significant. I stopped typing and asked him to clarify. He repeated his answer verbatim. I asked if he remembered what we had discussed last week. He nodded. I asked him to summarize it. He recited our entire previous conversation word for word, including my questions. At first, I considered this a symptom: perseveration, echolalia, or perhaps a manifestation of obsessive recall linked to his diagnosed condition. I made a note in his file and adjusted my line of questioning, deliberately choosing different phrasing. I asked, "What's been on your mind lately?" He paused for exactly 4 seconds, then said, "About the same. No significant changes." I tried again. "Tell me about your week." Another pause. Same response, same length, same tone. I ended the session early and reviewed his chart. His diagnosis included generalized anxiety and mild dissociative features, but nothing that would explain this level of rigidity. I consulted with a colleague who suggested the patient might be exhibiting a defensive routine, a way of controlling the therapeutic environment. I found that explanation reasonable. I scheduled our next session and resolved to disrupt the pattern. The following Tuesday, I changed my opening entirely. I asked him about his childhood. Before I finished the sentence, he said, "About the same. No significant changes." I asked him if he understood my question. He said, "How have you been feeling since our last session?" I had not asked that. He had. But his tone suggested he believed I had. I corrected him. He looked confused, then repeated my correction back to me in my own voice. Not mimicking, not mocking, just speaking. I stopped the session and left the room. I stood in the hallway for several minutes, reviewing my notes on my tablet. The session transcript was populating in real time, as it always did, generated by voice recognition software I had enabled months earlier. But the text was appearing faster than I was speaking. Full sentences materialized before I returned to the room. I scrolled down. The next 15 minutes of dialogue were already transcribed, formatted, time-stamped. I read through them. They described a conversation I had not yet had. I walked back into the room, sat down, and without meaning to, asked the exact question written in the transcript. He answered exactly as the text predicted. I conducted the rest of the session in silence, watching the words appear on my screen as I thought them, sometimes before I thought them. When the session ended, I closed the file and sat alone in my office for over an hour. I did not document what had happened. I did not know how. The following week, I arrived early and disabled the transcription software. I brought a paper notebook instead. I asked different questions, changed my seating position, delayed my opening remarks. It didn't matter. He repeated the session from 2 weeks prior. Then he repeated the session from 3 weeks prior. Then he repeated a session I had no memory of conducting. I checked my archived notes. The session existed, my handwriting, my phrasing, my signature at the bottom of the page, but I could not recall having written it. I began to notice that my progress notes were auto-completing. I would type the first few words of a clinical observation, and the rest of the sentence would populate itself. At first, I assumed this was a feature of the updated software, but the sentences were too specific, too precise. They referenced details I had not yet documented. behavioral cues I had not yet observed, responses the patient had not yet given. I deleted the auto-completions and typed my own summaries. When I reviewed the file the next day, my original text was gone. The auto-completed version had replaced it. I requested a meeting with my clinical supervisor. I explained the situation as carefully as I could. The repetitive dialogue, the pre-written transcripts, the sessions that seemed to precede themselves. She listened without interruption, then asked how long I had been experiencing this. I told her it had been happening for 4 weeks. She pulled up my schedule. According to the system, I had been seeing patient 1149 for 16 months, not 6. She showed me the appointment log, hundreds of sessions, all documented, all signed by me. I told her that was impossible. She asked if I had been experiencing memory difficulties. I said no. She suggested I take a brief medical leave. I refused. I told her I needed to understand what was happening. She said understanding was not always the goal of treatment. She said sometimes we simply needed to accept that certain processes were already in motion and our role was to see them through. I returned to my office and reviewed every session note I had written for patient 1149. They were identical, not similar, identical. Same questions, same answers, same clinical impressions, same closing summaries. The only variable was the date. I had been conducting the same session over and over for 16 months. And I had documented it every time as if it were new. I scheduled one final session. I entered the room and sat down without speaking. He looked at me, calm, expectant. I asked him if he knew what was happening. He said, "You've already asked me that." I told him I didn't remember. He said, "That's the difficult part. You won't. But you'll keep writing it down." I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked him how long this had been happening. He said, "Since the first session." I asked him which session that was. He smiled faintly. "The one we're about to finish." I looked down at my notebook. The page was full, my handwriting, my notes, a complete summary of a session I had not yet concluded. I flipped back through the pages. They were all full. Sessions I could not remember, observations I had not consciously made. At the bottom of the final page in my own handwriting was a single sentence. Patient reports difficulty distinguishing between completed sessions and sessions that feel completed. I have not seen patient 1149 since that day, but his sessions continue to appear in my calendar. My notes continue to populate. My signature continues to authorize treatment. And sometimes, late in the evening, I sit at my desk and open his file, scrolling through transcripts of conversations I do not remember having, wondering if I am still conducting them, or if they are conducting me. Some sessions, I have come to understand, do not end when we think they do. They simply repeat, session after session, until we can no longer tell the difference between what we've said and what we've always been saying. Story 4, the night nurse and the medication cart that was always short. I counted the medication cart 3 times before my shift began, and the inventory matched perfectly. 32 patients, 32 individually wrapped doses, each labeled with name, dosage, and administration time. I had been the night nurse on the extended care wing for nearly 4 years, and I prided myself on maintaining flawless documentation. Medication errors were the fastest way to lose a license, and I had never made one. That record ended the first night I found the cart 1 dose short. It was 11:47 when I noticed. I'd already completed my initial rounds and returned to the nurse's station to prepare the midnight distribution. I laid out each packet in order of room number, cross-referencing the patient list as I went. When I reached the end, I had 31 doses. I recounted. Still 31. I checked the delivery log from the pharmacy. 32 doses signed in. I checked the controlled substance register. No discrepancies. I checked the trash bin, the floor, the pockets of my scrubs. Nothing. I reviewed the patient roster, 32 names, all accounted for, all currently admitted. I called the pharmacy and asked if there had been a packing error. The overnight pharmacist sounded annoyed but confirmed the count. 32 doses. She asked if I'd checked the cart thoroughly. I told her I had. She suggested I recount. I did. The result didn't change. I documented the shortage in the incident log, noting that no patient would miss a dose as all 32 packets were present earlier in the evening. I filed the report and continued my shift. The following night it happened again. This time, I counted the cart immediately upon receiving it from the evening nurse. 32 doses. I locked the cart and kept it in my direct line of sight for the next 3 hours. At 11:50, I unlocked it to begin distribution. 31 doses. I stood there staring at the empty slot where the 32nd packet should have been, trying to understand how something could vanish from a locked cart I had never left unattended. I called my supervisor. She came down to the wing, reviewed the cart, checked my logs, and asked if I was certain I had counted correctly the first time. I told her I was. She asked if I was experiencing unusual stress. I said no. She made a note in her tablet and told me to continue monitoring the situation. She did not say she believed me, but she also did not say she didn't. Over the following week, the shortage became routine. Every night, one dose disappeared. I tried different strategies, counting multiple times, photographing the cart before and after each distribution, enlisting another nurse to verify my counts. It made no difference. The cart was always short by one, and yet every patient received their medication. No one complained. No charts reflected a missed dose. I began to suspect the missing medication corresponded to a patient not listed on the active roster. I reviewed the discharge records for the past 6 months, looking for anyone who might have been recently released or transferred. I found no irregularities. I checked the beds. All 32 rooms were occupied by the correct patients. I checked the call logs, 32 active call buttons, all functioning. Then, on my 9th consecutive night of missing doses, the call button for room 321 lit up. Room 321 was not on my roster. It wasn't on any roster. According to the wing layout, the numbering skipped from 320 to 322 due to a structural quirk in the building's original design. There was no room 321, and yet the call light was flashing. I walked down the hallway slowly, checking each room number as I passed. 317, 319, 320. Then a door I had never consciously noticed, unmarked, wedged between 320 and 322 in a narrow recess that seemed too small to accommodate a full room. The call light above the door was illuminated. I knocked softly. No response. I tried my master key card. The lock clicked open. I pushed the door inward and stepped inside. The room was identical to every other room on the wing. Narrow bed, small desk, single window with reinforced glass. A patient was lying in the bed, facing the wall. I could not see their face. I announced myself and asked if they needed assistance. They did not move. I checked the whiteboard mounted beside the door where patient names and care instructions were typically listed. The board was blank except for a single handwritten note. Medication administered nightly at 1200 hours. I felt a strange, creeping certainty settle over me. I asked the patient their name. They did not answer. I checked the chart holder mounted outside the door. It was empty. I returned to the nurse's station and searched the electronic health record system for any patient assigned to room 321. No results. I searched for patients with missing medication records. No results. I returned to the room with my medication card and looked through the remaining packets. 31. I checked the names. all accounted for. But beneath the last packet, tucked into the corner of the cart's tray, was a single unmarked dose. No label, no name, just a small sealed packet containing 2 white tablets. I had not seen it during my earlier counts. I stood in the doorway holding the unmarked packet, staring at the figure in the bed. I asked if this medication was theirs. They did not respond. I asked if they had been a patient here before. Silence. I asked if they remembered me. And then quietly they said, "You bring it every night." I felt my breath catch. I asked how long they had been here. They said, "Since you started forgetting." I placed the packet on the bedside table, backed out of the room, and locked the door behind me. I returned to the nurse's station and pulled up the duty logs for every night shift I had worked in the past 4 years. I searched for any mention of room 321, any documentation of an unmarked medication, any record of a patient I could not name. There was nothing. But in the margin of several logs, written in my own handwriting, were small, barely legible notes. Extra dose administered, patient stable. I asked my supervisor the next morning if room 321 existed. She looked at me for a long moment, then pulled up the building schematic on her computer. The room was not on the map. She asked why I was asking. I told her I'd received a call light from that room. She asked if I had responded. I said yes. She asked what I had found. I told her a patient who wasn't on the roster. She closed the schematic and said, "Then you didn't find anything." I stopped asking questions after that. But every night at 11:50 I count the medication cart and find it short by 1 dose. And every night at 1200 hours the call light for room 321 illuminates. I respond. I bring the unmarked packet. I place it on the bedside table. The patient never moves. I never see their face. And when I return to the nurse's station, my logs auto-complete with a single line, "Extra dose administered, patient stable." I have begun to notice that my own name appears occasionally in the medication roster, listed at the very bottom beneath the 32 active patients. No room number, no dosage. Just my name, followed by the words, "Administered nightly." I have not yet found the corresponding dose, but I know it's only a matter of time before the cart is short again, and I will have to decide whether to count myself among the patients I serve, or continue distributing what has already been prescribed. Some nights, the hardest part of the job is not remembering who needs care. It's remembering whether you're still the one providing it. Story 5. The records archivist who found her own diagnosis. I had been cataloging patient files for the Westbrook State Psychiatric Hospital for 7 years when I discovered a record that bore my full name. It was a routine audit, the kind I conducted quarterly to ensure compliance with state retention policies. I was working my way through the sealed archives, files from patients who had been deceased or discharged for over a decade, when I pulled a folder marked with a reference code I didn't recognize. I opened it, expecting outdated intake paperwork or a misplaced transfer summary. Instead, I found my name typed neatly across the top of the first page. Beneath it, my date of birth. Beneath that, a diagnosis I had never received. The file was thick, perhaps 200 pages, and organized with the same meticulous structure I used in my own work. Intake assessment, treatment history, progress notes, incident reports, discharge summary. The admission date was listed as 11 years prior, 4 years before I had accepted my position at Westbrook. The attending psychiatrist's signature was illegible, but the staff identification number was clear. I cross-referenced it in the employee database. The number had never been assigned. I read the intake assessment slowly, my hands trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. The handwriting was not mine, but the voice was. The patient, listed under my name, described symptoms I had never experienced, intrusive thoughts about archival work, compulsive reorganization of personal records, a persistent belief that her memories were being systematically documented by an external observer. The assessment concluded with a recommendation for long-term residential treatment and close monitoring. I flipped to the progress notes. They were written in first person, as if the patient had been asked to document her own treatment. The entries described daily routines I recognized: morning rounds, group therapy, supervised recreation. But the voice was mine, the phrasing, the syntax, the habitual use of passive construction. I read one entry dated 9 years prior. I have begun to notice that my memories feel less like experiences and more like records I am required to maintain. I am uncertain whether I am recalling events or simply reading descriptions of them. I closed the file and sat in silence for several minutes. I checked the reference code again, searching for any indication that this was a clerical error, a misfiled document, or a training simulation I had forgotten. There was none. I looked at the shelf from which I had pulled the file. It was in perfect chronological order, slotted between records from patients admitted in the same year. I checked the accession log. The file had been cataloged 7 years ago. By me. My signature was in the log. My handwriting, my employee identification number. I took the file to my supervisor and explained what I had found. She reviewed it without expression, then asked if I recognized the patient. I told her the patient was me. She asked if I had ever been treated at Westbrook. I said no. She asked if I had any family members who shared my name. I said no. She closed the file, handed it back to me, and suggested I reshelve it. She said archival work could sometimes create a sense of over-familiarity with institutional records, and that it was not uncommon for staff to experience moments of misidentification. I told her this was not a moment of misidentification. She said that perhaps I needed a few days off. I did not take time off. I returned to the archives and searched for additional records under my name. I found 3 more files, each dated progressively closer to the present. The second file documented a relapse 2 years after the initial discharge. The third described a readmission 18 months ago. The fourth was dated 6 months prior and remained open. The most recent progress note, written in my handwriting, was dated 2 weeks ago. It read, "Patient demonstrates increasing awareness of archival discrepancies. Continues to believe she is employed by the institution. Responds well to structured tasks. Prognosis remains guarded." I checked my employment records. I had been hired 7 years ago. My personnel file contained my application, my resume, my background check, and my signed offer letter. Everything appeared legitimate. I called the Human Resources Department and asked them to verify my start date. They confirmed it. I asked if there was any record of my having been a patient prior to my employment. They said no. I asked if they could double-check. They said they already had. I began to notice inconsistencies in my own documentation. I would catalog a file, log it in the database, and return the next day to find it missing from both the shelf and the system. I would search for it using the reference code I had assigned, and the system would return no results. But the file would reappear days later, recatalogued under a different code, with my signature in the accession log. I started photographing my work, taking pictures of each file I processed, each entry I made. When I reviewed the photos, I found images of files I did not remember handling, bearing codes I had not assigned, containing records I had not read. I began to suspect that I was not cataloging the archives. I was completing them. I found a memo in my desk drawer dated 3 years prior, written in my supervisor's hand. It was addressed to the clinical director and concerned my work performance. The memo noted that I had been an exemplary archivist, but that recent entries suggested increasing conflation between professional duties and personal narrative. The memo recommended continued monitoring. It was marked confidential and filed in a folder labeled with my name. I had no memory of seeing it before. I returned to my own patient file and read through every page with clinical detachment, as if reviewing a stranger's case. The file described a patient who believed she had been hired to organize records but was, in fact, completing a therapeutic exercise designed to help her process fragmented memories. It described how the patient's identity had become enmeshed with the archives, how she had begun to view herself not as a person but as a file to be maintained. The treatment plan involved allowing the patient to continue her work under supervised conditions, gradually introducing evidence of her diagnosis until she could integrate the information without destabilizing. I found the discharge summary dated for next month. It was already written, already signed. It described a patient who had successfully completed treatment and accepted her diagnosis. It described a final session in which the patient acknowledged that her memories were not being documented by an external observer but by herself, as part of a long-term therapeutic intervention. The summary concluded with a note of caution. Patient may experience residual confusion regarding the boundary between archival work and personal history. Recommend follow-up if symptoms re-emerge. I have continued cataloging files. I do not know if I am employed here or if I am completing a treatment protocol. I do not know if my supervisor is my manager or my therapist. I do not know if the badge I scan each morning grants me access to the archives or simply marks my location within them. What I do know is that missing records have begun to reappear in their proper places, filed with perfect precision, logged under codes I do not remember assigning. And each time I find one, I recognize my handwriting in the margins, my voice in the progress notes, my signature at the bottom of the page. Some files, I have come to understand, are not closed when treatment ends. They are closed when the patient accepts that they were always part of the record, that their memories were never separate from the documentation, and that the archive was never something they worked in. It was something they became. I no longer try to distinguish between the files I catalog and the file I am cataloging. I simply continue my work, meticulous and unending, knowing that somewhere in these stacks, my own discharge summary is waiting to be filed. And when it is, I will sign it, date it, and shelve it in perfect chronological order because that is what archivists do. We preserve what has already been written, even when the story is our own. Story 6. The Dietary Supervisor's Vanishing Meal Ticket. The meal ticket appeared in my inbox at 13:43 on a Friday afternoon, 1:43 p.m. precisely. I remember the exact time because I'd just finished reviewing the weekend menu with my kitchen staff and was preparing to leave for the day. Our facility, Riverside Gardens Extended Care, operated on a strict meal schedule. Breakfast at 07:30, lunch at 1200 hours, dinner at 17:30. Late trays were rare and required specific documentation. The ticket showed, late tray request, dinner, 18:30 hours. The room number was listed as 412. No resident name, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes the nursing staff submitted requests quickly and didn't fill in all fields. The dietary restriction section was blank. The ticket was marked urgent, highlighted in red by the system. I pulled up the facility room directory. Our building only had 3 floors. Room numbers ranged from 101 through 345. There was no 4th floor. There was no room 412. I called the nursing station. This is Sandra in dietary. I have a late tray request for room 412. Can you tell me who submitted this? The charge nurse checked her system. I don't show any late tray requests from our floor today. and 412 isn't a valid room number. The ticket came through the dietary system. It's showing in my queue. Must be a system error. Delete it and submit a ticket to IT. I should have followed that advice. But something about the request bothered me. The timestamp was current. The formatting was correct. It looked exactly like every other legitimate late tray ticket I processed dozens of times per week. The only anomaly was the impossible room number. I decided to check the room directory more carefully. Maybe 412 was a typo. Maybe it should have been 312 or 242. I cross-referenced recent late tray requests. No patterns emerged. I checked resident admission logs. No one had specific meal timing requirements that would necessitate an 1830 dinner. I forwarded the ticket to my assistant supervisor, Karen, and asked if she recognized it. She called me 2 minutes later. "Where did you get this ticket?" "It came through the system. Why?" "Sandra, this ticket is dated January 1994. I looked at my screen again. The date field clearly showed today's date. "It's showing current date on my end. On mine, it's January 10th, 1994, and the meal request is formatted in the old style we used before the software update in 2003. I haven't seen a ticket that looks like this in over 20 years. We compared what we were seeing. On my screen, current date, modern formatting, room 412. On Karen's screen, January 1994, vintage formatting, same room number, same ticket, 2 different versions depending on who accessed it. I logged out of the system and back in. The ticket remained still showing current date. Karen logged out and back in. Her version still showed 1994. We were looking at the same data record displaying impossible variations. "Should we prepare the tray?" Karen asked. "For a room that doesn't exist? The ticket is in the system. If it's legitimate and we don't fulfill it, that's a dietary violation. If it's not legitimate, we can document the system error and move on." Her logic was sound. I told her to prepare a standard dinner tray, protein, vegetable, starch, dessert, beverage, with no specific restrictions since none were listed. We'd deliver it to wherever room 412 was supposed to be, document the attempt, and file the incident report. Karen prepared the tray by 1800 hours, 6 p.m. I accompanied her to attempt delivery. We started on the 4th floor, except there was no 4th floor. The elevator buttons only went to 3. The stairwell access doors were marked, ground, 2nd, 3rd. No 4th floor option existed in the building's physical layout. "Maybe it's a wing designation," Karen suggested, "like Building 4, Room 12. Riverside Gardens was a single building, no separate structures, no campus layout, just one 3-story facility with 126 beds. We tried the 3rd floor, checking if there was any room that could be mistaken for 412. Room 312 existed, occupied by Mrs. Helena Barnes, who'd eaten dinner at the regular 1730 service. She hadn't requested a late tray. We checked 212, same situation, 142 fully occupied, no late requests. We returned to the dietary office with the tray. Karen suggested we document the failed delivery and refrigerate the tray in case the request was legitimate but misdirected. I agreed. She stored the tray in the walk-in cooler, labeled with the ticket number and time. I stayed late to complete the incident report. At 1845, my system chimed with a new notification. "Late tray, 412, delivered and signed." The ticket had updated itself to show completion. The signature field showed, "Received by resident, 1832. I called Karen. "Did you deliver that tray after I left?" "No, I put it in the cooler like we discussed." "Why?" "The system shows it was delivered and signed for at 1832. She went to check the cooler, called me back 3 minutes later. "The tray is gone. Someone must have taken it for another resident." No, the cooler is locked. I'm the only one with the key. The tray was here 15 minutes ago when I did my final check. Now it's gone. But the lock wasn't forced. No one else accessed the cooler. We reviewed security footage the next day, Monday, after I'd spent the weekend trying not to think about impossible deliveries and self-completing tickets. The footage showed Karen placing the tray in the cooler at 18:15 on Friday. The timestamp was clear. Then nothing. No one entered the cooler. The door remained closed. At 18:32, the tray was simply gone. One frame showed it present, the next frame showed empty space where it had been. No transition, no explanation. Equipment malfunction, the security manager said. Sometimes the cameras skip frames during recording errors. But the timestamp progression was smooth. No gaps, no missing seconds, just present to absent instantaneously. Monday afternoon, another ticket appeared. Late tray request, breakfast, 0800 hours. Room 412 again. This time the dietary restrictions field was filled in. Soft diet, no dairy, pureed protein. I prepared the tray myself this time. Oatmeal with no milk, pureed scrambled eggs, white toast, apple juice. I documented every step with photos, time-stamped each stage of preparation. At 07:58, I placed the completed tray on a delivery cart in the dietary office. I locked the office door. I was the only person present. At 0800 exactly, I unlocked the door. The tray was gone. The ticket updated, delivered and signed, 0803. This pattern continued daily for 2 weeks. Every afternoon, a new late tray request appeared for room 412. Each request specified different meal times, different dietary restrictions, different menu items. I prepared each tray. Each tray disappeared from secured locations, locked offices, locked coolers, even once from a tray cart I was actively pushing down the hallway. One moment present, next moment absent. And every ticket updated itself to show successful delivery signed by the resident of room 412 who didn't exist. I started investigating the facility's history. I contacted the original construction company, defunct since 2005. I reached the architect's firm. They'd been bought out twice, but I eventually found the original building plans in county records. Riverside Gardens had been designed as a 4-story building in 1968. The 4th floor was completed structurally, but never finished with interior systems due to budget constraints. The plans showed room layouts for the unbuilt floor. Room 412 was designated as a corner unit, double occupancy with windows facing east. I requested access to the roof. The maintenance supervisor, Tom, took me up. The roof access required going through a locked hatch on the 3rd floor ceiling. We climbed a fixed ladder into the space above. The 4th floor existed, not as finished space, but as structure. Concrete floor, load-bearing walls, window frames without glass. The space was open to the elements in places where roofing material had degraded. Pigeons nested in the corners. Decades of rain had created water damage and mold growth. But in one area, someone had created a room. Drywall scraps had been arranged to form walls. A door frame had been constructed from salvaged lumber. The room was approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, matching the dimensions shown on the architectural plans for room 412. Inside, there was furniture. A hospital bed, old style, the kind with manual crank adjustments. A bedside table, a chair, all of it rusted, water-damaged, covered in bird droppings and grime. But deliberately arranged, positioned as if the space were an actual resident room. On the bedside table, I found meal trays, dozens of them, stacked carefully, sorted by meal type. Breakfast trays on the left, lunch in the middle, dinner on the right. The trays were from our facility. I recognized the particular style of compartmented plate, the color of the serving covers. but the trays showed various states of age. Some looked recent, food residue still present. Others were ancient, metal corroded. Food remains decomposed to stains. The most recent tray, on top of the dinner stack, held the meal I'd prepared Friday afternoon. 2 weeks old now, but identifiable. The protein was present, the vegetable side, the dessert. All arranged exactly as I'd plated it. The only difference was that the food had been partially consumed. Someone, or something, had eaten approximately half of each item before neatly replacing the serving covers. Tom was staring at the bed. Someone's been living up here. No one could live up here. There's no heat, no water, no electricity. Then how did all this get here? How did your trays get transported from locked rooms to this location? I had no answer. We searched the space thoroughly. No evidence of recent human habitation, no sleeping bag, no personal effects, no trash beyond the meal trays. The bed showed water damage and rust, no indication anyone had actually lain on it in years. But the meal trays were real. I counted them. 83 trays total, representing approximately 6 weeks of daily deliveries. Every tray I'd prepared in response to the 412 tickets was accounted for, arranged chronologically in neat stacks. We reported the finding to facility administration. The director, Mr. Carlson, came up to inspect. He stood in that makeshift room for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said, "There was a resident up here, a long time ago." "The 4th floor was never completed," I said. "Officially, no. But in 1973, we had overcrowding. We were over capacity by 4 residents, and the state was threatening citations. The director at the time, not me, this was before my tenure, made an arrangement. He finished one room on the 4th floor off books, just enough to make it habitable. He moved a resident up here temporarily, told the state auditors the resident had been transferred to family care. That's illegal. Very. But it solved the short-term problem. The resident who was moved, his name was Vincent Marsh. No family, no visitors, late-stage dementia. The director felt he wouldn't notice the relocation. Vincent lived up here for approximately 8 months before he died. Natural causes, age-related decline. When he passed, they dismantled the room somewhat but left the basic structure. The incident was buried in paperwork. When did he die? January 1994. The date on Karen's version of the first meal ticket. January 10th, 1994. Vincent's meals were delivered up here for those 8 months, Mr. Carlson continued. Someone from dietary would bring trays 3 times daily. The deliveries were documented in a separate ledger that didn't integrate with the main meal service records. When Vincent died, the deliveries stopped. The room was closed off. Everyone involved in the arrangement eventually retired or left the facility. The story became institutional memory that faded with time. But the meal tickets are still generating, I said. Apparently so. We stood there in that decaying structure pretending to be a resident room, surrounded by evidence that someone's meal service had continued for 50 years past their death. And I felt a particular kind of horror that had nothing to do with ghosts or supernatural explanations. This was bureaucratic horror. System horror. The kind that emerges when processes outlive their purpose, when routines continue automatically long after the humans they served are gone. Mr. Carlson had the 4th floor access sealed more permanently. The meal trays were collected and disposed of. The makeshift room was dismantled. The space was treated for environmental hazards and locked behind a door welded shut. The meal tickets stopped appearing. My queue returned to normal requests from actual residents in actual rooms. Everything went back to routine dietary operations. But last week I received a message from the facility's IT department. They were migrating our meal service software to a new system, part of a corporate-wide upgrade. During the data transfer, they'd found anomalies in the historical records. Specifically, they'd found a meal service account that had been continuously active since 1973, generating approximately 3 requests per day for 51 years without interruption. Room 412, Vincent Marsh. Dietary restrictions updated periodically to reflect changing medical protocols, meal preferences adjusted based on some unknowable algorithm. Delivery times varying slightly but consistently maintained. The system had been feeding Vincent for half a century, documenting every meal, recording every delivery, tracking compliance with nutritional requirements. The account had accumulated over 55,000 meal tickets in its history, each one marked delivered and signed. Not a single missed meal in 51 years. When I'd asked if they should migrate this account to the new system, I told them no. Archive it. Close it. End the service. They did. The account was terminated. Vincent Marsh's meal service officially concluded at 1700 hours on the date of system migration. That night I had a dream. I was preparing a tray. Standard dinner, no special restrictions. I was plating it with the careful attention I give to every meal, making sure portions were correct. Presentation was appealing, nutrition was balanced. When I finished, I looked up to place the tray on the delivery cart. Vincent Marsh was standing in my kitchen. He wasn't threatening. He was just there. Elderly, thin, wearing a hospital gown that had been white decades ago but had faded to gray. He looked at the tray I'd prepared. He smiled slightly, then he said, "Thank you for the meals. 51 years of service. I appreciate your consistency." "I only started working here 5 years ago," I said. "The position continues. The meals continue. The person changes, but the service remains. You've been feeding me your entire career here. Every supervisor before you did the same. Dietary staff from 1973 until now. All of you preparing my trays, delivering them through systems and processes you didn't design but inherited. You've all been taking care of me in the only way the facility knows how. You died in 1994. Yes, but the meals kept coming. And when you're fed consistently for long enough, even after death, some part of you stays tethered. Some part keeps accepting delivery, keeps signing for receipt, keeps existing in the paperwork, if nowhere else." I woke up. It was 2:43 a.m. I checked my work email from my phone. One new message, time-stamped 0243, a meal ticket. Late tray request, snack, 0300 hours. Room 412. I didn't fulfill it. I deleted the ticket and went back to sleep. In the morning, it was gone from my deleted items folder. No record of it existed in my inbox or trash. But when I arrived at work and checked the dietary system, the ticket was marked, "Delivered and signed, 0307 hours." Someone had prepared that tray. Or something had. The system had found a way to continue the service even after I'd refused. The routine was too established, too deeply embedded in the facility's operational structure, to be ended by simple account closure or welded doors or conscious decisions to stop. Some meal services don't end when the resident dies. Some requests keep generating long after the person who needed feeding is gone. And sometimes the system finds ways to fulfill those requests regardless of locks or protocols or staff members who think they can simply delete a ticket and be done with it. Vincent Marsh is still being fed. Somewhere in Riverside Gardens infrastructure, in the software, in the documented processes, in the 51-year routine that predates every current staff member. His meals are being prepared and delivered and signed for. I prepared dietary plans for 126 residents across 3 floors. But I know there's a 127th resident being served. Room 412, up in the structure that was never finished, in the space the building created for him when he needed hiding. In the paperwork that never stops generating even when you tell it to stop. And every day someone prepares his meals. Maybe me, maybe Karen, maybe the new dietary aide who started last month and doesn't know the facility's history. We all contribute without knowing it, following tickets that appear in queues, fulfilling requests that seem routine until you look too closely at the room numbers and realize you're feeding someone who isn't supposed to exist anymore, but needs to be fed anyway. Because the system says so, because the ticket appeared, because 51 years of service creates an obligation that transcends life and death and the architectural limitations of 3-story buildings. Some residents never check out. They just move to floors we don't acknowledge, in rooms we don't visit, eating meals we don't remember preparing but that appear on trays we somehow delivered. Story 7. The Activities Coordinator's Endless Morning Routine. The first time I noticed the repetition, I dismissed it as coincidence. It was a Tuesday morning in late January, beginning of my shift at Green Valley Residential Care. I arrived at 8:30 as always, prepared for the 9 a.m. morning activity group in the main recreation room. 23 residents typically attended, the subset who were cognitively intact enough to engage with group activities but physically dependent enough to require residential care. I began the session at 900 hours precisely with my standard greeting. Good morning, everyone. Today is Tuesday, January 24th. Let's start with our morning stretches. Mrs. Dorothy Sinclair, seated in her usual spot near the window, immediately said, "My daughter Janet called last night. She's having trouble with her furnace again." Her voice had that particular quality of someone sharing news she found significant. 3 seats away, Mr. Albert Ross chuckled and said, "Isn't that always the way? Furnaces only break down in the coldest weather." His timing was perfect, following immediately after Mrs. Sinclair's comment. Then Mr. Leonard Graham coughed twice, sharp, dry coughs, and reached for his water glass. I proceeded with the stretching routine, moved into the morning trivia segment, concluded with a group sing-along of "You Are My Sunshine." The session ended at 9:45. Residents returned to their rooms or moved to the dining area for mid-morning snacks. Standard format, unremarkable execution. Wednesday morning. I arrived at 8:30, prepared the recreation room, began the 9 a.m. session with identical greeting. Good morning, everyone. Today is Wednesday, January 25th. Let's start with our morning stretches. Mrs. Dorothy Sinclair, same seat, same posture, said, "My daughter Janet called last night. She's having trouble with her furnace again." The words were identical. The inflection matched precisely. Mr. Albert Ross, without pause, responded, "Isn't that always the way? Furnaces only break down in the coldest weather." Same chuckle, same timing. Mr. Leonard Graham coughed twice, same rhythm, and reached for his water glass. The session proceeded identically to Tuesday. Same trivia questions elicited the same responses from the same residents. The sing-along went the same way, with Mr. Leonard Graham forgetting the second verse at the same point he'd forgotten it the day before. The session ended at 9:45 with residents dispersing in the same order. I told myself that elderly populations often establish rigid routines, memory care residents particularly so. It wasn't surprising that conversation topics would repeat, that social interactions would follow familiar patterns. This group had been meeting for months. They'd probably developed predictable dynamics. Thursday morning, identical greeting. Mrs. Sinclair's comment about Janet and the furnace, delivered with identical phrasing. Mr. Ross's response, word for word. Mr. Graham's 2 coughs, precisely timed. I interrupted the pattern. After Mrs. Sinclair's furnace comment, before Mr. Ross could respond, I said, "Oh, is this recent? You mentioned the same furnace problem yesterday." Mrs. Sinclair looked at me with mild confusion. Did I? I don't recall. Janet called last night. That's when I heard about it. You said the exact same thing yesterday morning, and the day before. She smiled politely. I don't think so, dear, but at my age, maybe I do repeat myself sometimes. Mr. Ross, right on cue despite my interruption, said, Isn't that always the way? Furnaces only break down in the coldest weather. I stared at him. Mr. Ross, you said that exact sentence with that exact timing for the past 3 days. He looked genuinely puzzled. It's just a common observation. Furnaces do tend to fail when you need them most. Mr. Graham coughed twice, reached for water. I proceeded with the session but documented every detail. I noted conversation snippets, the exact wording of resident responses during trivia, the timing of various events. At 9:45, I watched residents leave in the same order they'd left every previous day. Mrs. Sinclair first, then Mr. Jameson, then Mrs. Park, the sequence unchanging. Friday morning, I arrived at 8:20 instead of 8:30, hoping to disrupt the pattern by being early. I rearranged the seating, moved chairs into different configurations, changed the usual circle to a semicircle facing the windows. At 900 hours, residents entered and moved directly to the same seats they always occupied, despite the furniture rearrangement. They sat in the new chair locations that corresponded spatially to where their preferred seats had been, maintaining their relative positions to each other, even though the actual furniture was in different spots in the room. I changed my greeting. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Let's start today with a song instead of stretches. Mrs. Sinclair said, My daughter Janet called last night. She's having trouble with her furnace again. Mrs. Sinclair, I interrupted immediately. I need you to listen carefully. You've said that exact sentence at the start of every morning session this week. The exact same words about Janet and the furnace. Do you remember saying it before? She looked at me with an expression of patient concern, the kind elderly people give to younger people they think might be stressed. I don't recall mentioning it previously, dear, but it happened last night, so naturally I'm thinking about it this morning. What day is today? I asked. Friday, January 27th, she said without hesitation. What day did Janet call about the furnace? Last night, Thursday night. And you told me about it this morning? Yes, just now. What did you do yesterday? She thought for a moment. Yesterday was Thursday. I had breakfast at 7:30, then physical therapy at 10, then lunch, then my afternoon nap. The usual routine. Did we have morning activities yesterday? Of course, we have morning activities every weekday. What did we do during yesterday's session? Her expression became uncertain. I'm not sure I remember specifically. We did our usual activities, I imagine, stretches and trivia and singing. Did you mention Janet's furnace yesterday? I don't believe so. I only heard about it last night, but I had documentation proving she'd mentioned it Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and now Friday, each time claiming she'd heard about it last night, each time treating it as new information. Mr. Ross, on schedule, said, Isn't that always the way? Furnaces only break down in the coldest weather. I didn't respond to him. I addressed the entire group. How many of you remember what we did during yesterday's morning activities? Several hands raised. I called on Mr. Jameson. We did stretches, I believe, and trivia, the usual. Do you remember any specific trivia questions? He thought carefully. I don't recall the specific questions, no. I called on Mrs. Park. Do you remember yesterday's session? We met in this room and did our morning activities. Can you describe anything specific that happened? She looked uncomfortable. I'm afraid I don't remember details. At my age, the days tend to blend together. I checked my notes from yesterday's session. I documented the trivia questions. What president is on the $5 bill? Abraham Lincoln. What ocean is on the west coast of the United States? Pacific Ocean. What month comes after January? February. I ask these questions now, Friday morning, out of sequence from my planned activities. Mr. Ross answered, Abraham Lincoln. Mrs. Hawthorne answered, Pacific Ocean. Mr. Graham answered, February. The same residents who'd answered Thursday providing identical responses. I asked a question I hadn't asked before. What color is the ocean? Silence. No one answered. They looked at each other, uncertain. I rephrased using yesterday's format. What ocean is on the west coast of the United States? Mrs. Hawthorne immediately said, Pacific Ocean, as if the question had only become comprehensible when phrased in that specific way. The session continued along its predetermined path. Every attempt I made to deviate was either ignored or subtly corrected by the group's behavior until we returned to the established pattern. At 9:45, residents departed in the same sequence. I spent the weekend researching. I reviewed psychological literature on routine behavior in elderly populations, consulted articles about institutional rhythms and their effects on resident cognition. Nothing explained the mechanical precision of the repetition. Monday morning, I decided to not show up for the session. I stayed in my office watching the recreation room through the observation window. At 8:55, residents began entering the room. They took their seats in the usual arrangement. At 900 hours, Mrs. Sinclair spoke. I couldn't hear through the window, but I saw her lips move in the familiar pattern of her furnace comment. Mr. Ross responded, his head turning toward her at the expected moment. Mr. Graham coughed twice. The session proceeded without me. Residents went through the motions of stretches, responded to trivia questions that no one was asking, sang a song I couldn't hear but could identify by their lip movements,